There is a tablet. It came out of the ground in southern Iraq more than a century ago, and for almost that entire span, nobody in the academic mainstream has been willing to translate the final section in public. Not because the language is broken. Not because the clay surface is damaged. The tablet is in remarkable condition for its age. The reason is quieter than that, and older, and stranger. The reason has to do with what the lines actually say. In the reading that has surfaced, in the reading that a handful of Sumerologists have circulated in private correspondence and in one or two footnotes buried inside academic monographs that were quietly pulled from print, comets are not what you were told they are. They are not dirty snowballs drifting through the outer dark on random elliptical paths. They are not chunks of primordial ice left over from the birth of the solar system. According to the tablet, comets are carriers. They move on a scheduled route. They deliver a specific payload at specific points along that route. And the route itself, this long, looping circuit that touches the inner planets and then returns to somewhere beyond the reach of our telescopes, has an ending, a destination, a place the scribe called the throne of the deep gate. Tonight we are going to walk through that tablet from the first line to the last. We are going to look at what the payload appears to be, where the route begins, and where the tablet says it finally ends. Quick pause. And this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there's a second document. It's called the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the tablet's carved route, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That's all. Back to the video. The tablet itself is small, roughly the size of a paperback novel, cut from a fine buff clay, inscribed on both faces in the compact cuneiform script the temple scribes of the late 3rd millennium before our era used for astronomical records. It was recovered from the ruins of Nippur during one of the early European excavations, catalogued, shipped, and then almost immediately misplaced inside a storage vault where it sat, unread, for nearly 40 years. When it finally reached a translator, the first attempt at rendering it into English produced a text so strange that the museum quietly filed the translation as provisional and moved on to more conventional pieces from the same layer. The tablet was labeled a mythological fragment, a poetic account of the sky, a curiosity, and that is where it stayed on the official record for another 2 generations. But the translator who first opened it did not stop working on it. He kept a private notebook, he kept correspondence. And through that correspondence, through letters passed between 3 scholars in 3 different countries across the decades that followed, a much more careful reading of the tablet slowly took shape. That reading is what we are dealing with tonight. Not the official mythological fragment, the private reading, the one the translators kept between themselves because none of them wanted to be the first name attached to it in a published paper. The tablet opens with a phrase that appears in dozens of other Sumerian astronomical documents, a phrase that literally means the wanderers who cross the sky bearing gifts. In the standard translation, the wanderers are identified as planets. Nothing unusual there. The Sumerians tracked 5 naked eye planets and gave each of them a personality, a role, a divine name. But the tablet very quickly makes clear that the wanderers it is describing are not those 5 bodies. They are something else. Something the scribe explicitly separates from the fixed heavenly seats, from the courts of the sun and moon, from the great turning wheel of the fixed stars. The wanderers on this tablet come from outside. They enter the ordered sky. They pass through it. And then they leave again, on a path that is not the path of any planet. In every place where a modern reader would expect to see the Sumerian word for a bright, long-haired star, which is how the ancient world normally described what we now call a comet, this tablet uses a different phrase entirely. The phrase is closer to something like the ferrying ones, or the ones who carry a cross. And that shift in vocabulary, that single deliberate choice of words, is the crack through which the entire alternate reading enters the text. To understand why that vocabulary shift matters, you have to understand how careful the Sumerian temple scribes were with their word choices. These were not folk storytellers writing down stray legends. The scribes attached to the great temples of Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu were record keepers of the most obsessive kind. When they wrote about the sky, they used a technical language that had been refined across many centuries. A star was a star. A planet was a planet. A comet, meaning a bright object with a tail that appeared unpredictably and then vanished, had its own well-established compound word. The scribes did not confuse these categories. They did not swap them out for poetic effect. So when a tablet uses a completely different term, a term that does not appear in any of the standard astronomical glossaries, a term whose root meaning is closer to a boat that carries cargo across a river than it is to any word for a light in the sky that is not a metaphor. That is a scribe deliberately telling you that the thing being described is not what you think it is. This is where the second translator, the one who took over the notebooks after the first passed away, made his controversial move. He argued in a private paper that has since circulated in photocopy for decades that the tablet is not describing comets as astronomical phenomena at all. It is describing them as vehicles, objects with a function, objects on a mission. The word for the tail of one of these wanderers in the tablet is not the word the Sumerians normally used for the shining hair of a long-haired star. It is instead a word that shows up in shipping manifests, a word that literally names the wake a heavy vessel leaves in water when it is dragging something behind it. That is not accidental. In the second translator's reading, the scribe is telling you that these objects are pulling something, trailing something, releasing something as they move. And the tablet, over its next several lines, tells you precisely what. It tells you what is in the wake. It tells you what falls out of it. It tells you where that material lands. And it tells you what happens to a world when the material lands on it. That section, the middle third of the tablet, is the section that the mainstream translators refused to publish. Not because they could not read it, because they could not stand next to it professionally. To publish that middle section, in the reading it actually supports, would end a career. So they published the first third, they gestured vaguely at the last third, and they left the middle section as a placeholder in the museum record. A blank marked as damaged, even though the clay is intact and the signs are legible. If this tablet stood alone, it would be easy to dismiss. A single scribe writing something eccentric. One clay fragment out of the many thousands that have come out of Mesopotamia. It could be an outlier. It could be a copyist's private joke. It could be an experimental piece of poetry that got misfiled with the astronomical archive. That is what most careful scholars would want to conclude, and it is what several of them tried to conclude for as long as they could. The problem is that this tablet does not stand alone. There are others. Fragments recovered from Uruk in the years just before the First World War. A cylinder from Sippar catalogued in a Baghdad collection that was later scattered. A partial duplicate of the middle section that turned up in a private European collection in the 1930s, published in a single, obscure journal and then never referenced again. Each of these pieces overlaps with our tablet in specific places. Each of them uses the same unusual vocabulary. Each of them describes the same class of object, the same route across the sky, and the same act of delivery. When you line them up next to one another, and a small handful of researchers have done exactly that, working from photographs and rubbings and the occasional grainy museum plate, you get something that stops looking like an eccentric fragment and starts looking like a coherent body of teaching, a doctrine, almost. A shared understanding among a specific circle of scribes about what these wandering carriers were, what they moved between the stars and the inner sky, and what their arrival meant for the world below. And that shared understanding lines up, in places that are difficult to ignore, with material from the Enuma Elish, with material from the Era Epic, and with the older fragments of what modern scholars have loosely called the seed literature. All of them, in different registers and with different emphases, describe the same fundamental picture. Something comes from far outside. It moves along a path that is repeatable and predictable. It arrives here. It leaves something behind. It continues on to somewhere else. And the somewhere else, the terminus of the route, is a place these texts describe in ways that no straightforward reading can reduce to poetry. The Sumerian scribes were not describing a solar orbit as we understand it. They were describing a delivery circuit, and they were describing a receiver at the end of the circuit, someone waiting for the cargo. Something the tablet calls, in its final section, the one who tallies the returned ships. That phrase is where any serious reading of the tablet has to pause. The one who tallies the returned ships. It is written in the same clean scribal hand as the astronomical section, without any of the poetic flourishes the Sumerians used when they were describing gods in their more literary registers. It is not marked as metaphor. It is not marked as ritual language. It is placed in the tablet exactly where a modern engineer would place the name of a receiving station on a shipping schedule. Whoever wrote this tablet believed that the objects being described actually returned somewhere, actually docked, actually delivered their cargo to someone or something that kept count of the deliveries. And that belief, encoded so plainly into what is otherwise a straightforward technical text, is what forces the modern reader into a decision. Either the scribe was inventing a piece of speculative fiction and dressing it up in the vocabulary of a working astronomical record, which no other Sumerian scribe is known to have done in any surviving document, or the scribe was reporting something, passing on a piece of knowledge that had reached him from an older source and that he believed to be accurate. And once you allow, even provisionally, that the tablet is reporting rather than inventing, everything that comes next begins to matter in a way that is very hard to walk back from. Before we move on to the payload, stop for a second. What you just heard about the tablet only makes sense on the full timeline. Next to the 6 resets before it, cycles repeat. The 8th is closing in. It's all in, the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. What's next builds on it. QR code on screen. The payload. This is where the mainstream translators went silent, because the middle section of the tablet, the section they refused to render into English for public consumption, does not describe the interior of a comet the way any astronomer would describe it. It does not talk about ice. It does not talk about volatile gases. It does not talk about rocky nuclei or dust trails or any of the phenomena that our own instruments have confirmed exist inside these bodies. Instead, the tablet uses a phrase that translates most cleanly as the seed of the sky. In some parallel passages from the related fragments, the same substance is called the living rain, or the salt of the beginning, or the pale water that remembers. Every one of those phrases points in the same direction. Whatever the tablet believed comets carried, it was something the scribes considered alive, or at least capable of carrying life. It was not inert matter. It was cargo with a purpose, and the tablet is unusually specific about what that purpose is. In the reading, the second translator committed to paper. The payload is described as being released in specific quantities at specific stations along the route. Not spilled, not lost, released. The Sumerian verb the scribe uses in this passage is the same verb that appears in agricultural texts describing the sowing of seed by a farmer moving down a furrow. The image is not one of a comet shedding debris because it is falling apart in the heat of the inner system. The image is one of a deliberate act of planting. Someone or something is sowing the inner system, world by world, as the carrier moves through. And the substance being sown, in the tablet's account, is not a mineral. It is not a metal. It is described as an ancestor material. The literal phrase is closer to the flesh from which the flesh was drawn, which is language that Sumerian scribes only ever used in one other kind of document, and that is the priestly commentary on the creation of the first mortal beings from the clay of the ground and the blood of a slain god. In other words, the tablet is claiming, in a technical astronomical register, that comets carry the same essential substance that was used to make us, and that they distribute it, along their route, into the atmospheres and the oceans and the soils of the worlds they pass. Whether or not you find that claim credible, it is what the tablet actually says. It is not what the translator invented. It is not what the scribe was hedging around with metaphor. It is written plainly, in the same clean hand, in the same technical vocabulary, on the same clay surface as the rest of the astronomical record. And it lines up in a way that no single scribe could have coordinated on his own, with the payload descriptions in the other fragments, all of which use variations of the same phrase: the seed, the living rain, the flesh from which the flesh was drawn. Comets, in this ancient reading, are the machinery of a continuous seeding operation, and that operation has been running, according to the tablet, since long before there was anyone here to notice it. The route. If the payload section is the part the mainstream translators refused to render, the route section is the part they most struggled to explain away. Because unlike the payload description, which they could at least try to categorize as poetic language about the substances of creation, the route description is stubbornly geographical. It gives directions, it names stations, it orders them in a sequence, and that sequence, when a modern reader plots it against what we now know about the layout of the solar system, is uncomfortably coherent. The tablet begins the route in the outer dark. It uses a phrase for the point of origin that translates as the cold field beyond the quartz, which several commentators have suggested corresponds to the region we would now call the outer edge of the planetary zone, or possibly the inner reach of the great cloud of frozen bodies that lies beyond the orbit of the outermost known planet. From that origin point, the carrier is described as falling inward along a long, slow arc. The scribe notes that the arc bends first past the seat of the Great Turning One, which is the standard Sumerian name for the largest of the wanderers, the body we now call Jupiter. The tablet says the carrier releases nothing at this station. It only bends its path here. It uses the mass of the Great Turning One to sharpen its trajectory and to swing itself down toward the inner sky. The next station is described as the red field, which is essentially every commentator's shorthand for what we call Mars. Here, the tablet says the carrier releases a first portion of its cargo, a small portion, The scribe uses a measure word that in agricultural texts describes the smallest handful a farmer would sow at the beginning of a row, almost as a test before committing to the full field. The image is careful. The Sumerians thought of the release at the red field as a first sowing, not a main one. From the red field, the tablet describes the carrier crossing the inner air, which in the context of the surrounding astronomical vocabulary most naturally means the space between Mars and Earth. And it is at the next station, the one the scribe calls the blue field, or in some parallel fragments, the green field where the water gathers, that the main release is described. This is the station where the carrier deposits what the tablet calls the greater portion of the cargo, and it is described in language that is impossible to read as anything other than a direct account of atmospheric entry. The scribe writes about the cargo entering the upper air. He writes about it settling through the winds. He writes about it reaching the water and the ground. He writes about it entering the flesh of what is already growing there. And he writes about the world receiving it as a field receives the sower. From the blue field, the tablet says, the carrier turns again. It uses the mass of the sun, which the scribe calls the great seat of light, not to release cargo but to change its heading. It slingshots. It bends. It uses the sun the same way it used Jupiter, as a gravitational pivot to redirect itself onto the return leg. And then it climbs, slowly, over what the tablet describes as a long time counted in the turnings of many generations, back toward the outer dark, not toward its point of origin, toward somewhere else. Somewhere else. That is the phrase every reader eventually gets stuck on, because the tablet is not vague about it. The tablet describes the terminus in a very specific way. The return leg of the route does not end where the carrier began. It does not close a simple loop. It ends at a station the scribe calls, in the tablet's most quoted line, the throne of the deep gate. And that phrase, in the technical language of Sumerian cosmology, does not correspond to any planet, any known heavenly body, any part of the ordered sky the scribes normally mapped. The throne of the deep gate is a location that appears in only a handful of other texts, and every one of those texts uses it to describe something functionally identical, a seated authority, a place where records are kept, a place where the returning carriers are received, counted, and unloaded of whatever they have not already delivered along the route. In some fragments, the phrase is expanded into the throne of the deep gate, where the tallies are held. In others, it is contracted to simply the far seat. In one particularly striking parallel from a later Assyrian copy, the terminus is described as the house that no wanderer of the ordered sky can reach, which is a way of saying, in the terms available to that scribe, that the terminus is not inside the normal planetary system at all, it is beyond it. And this is where the tablet reaches into territory that has kept researchers awake for a very long time. Because the description of the terminus, taken together with the description of the return leg, points to a location that would not be at the inner edge of the outer dark, where the route began. It would be considerably farther out, in a place that would, from the tablet's own map of the sky, correspond to a body or a structure that our own astronomy has spent decades looking for, and that a small number of orbital anomaly studies have suggested is really there. Whatever you want to call it, the far seat, the throne of the deep gate, the house beyond the ordered wanderers. The tablet says the returning carriers dock at that place, are counted at that place, are refilled at that place, and are sent out again, on the next long, slow fall inward, toward the red field, and the blue field, and the great turning one, and the seat of light, on a schedule, in a rotation, forever, as far as the scribe was concerned. Because as far as the scribe was concerned, this circuit had already been running for longer than the memory of any people, and it was not going to stop. Which brings us back to the tablet itself, to the small paperback-sized piece of buff clay that has been sitting in a storage vault, or a private collection, or a shifting sequence of both, for more than 100 years. Nothing about the physical object is unusual. It is not made of a strange material. It is not inscribed with a strange script. If you saw it in a museum case, next to an ordinary Sumerian accounting tablet, or an ordinary poetic fragment, you would not notice anything about it that would set it apart. That is part of what has always made it so difficult to deal with. It does not look like it should carry the weight it carries. It looks like a receipt. It looks like a scribal exercise. It looks like the least remarkable kind of object a specialist can pull out of a drawer. And that is exactly the problem. Because if the tablet is what it appears to be, and if the reading that has slowly assembled itself out of the private notebooks and the pulled monographs and the photocopied papers passed between 3 scholars over 4 decades is anything close to accurate, then somebody in southern Iraq, more than 4,000 years ago, sat down at a scribe's bench and calmly wrote out a working description of a delivery system. A system that begins in the outer dark, that touches at least 3 of the inner planets, that uses the largest of the gas giants and the sun itself as gravitational pivots, that seeds each of the receiving worlds with what the scribe considered a living material, and that terminates at a station beyond the ordered planets, a station where the carriers are received, counted, and refilled, and they wrote it out as if it were a matter of ordinary knowledge, as if any competent scribe would recognize what was being described, as if it did not need to be argued for. That is the piece that has kept the mainstream translators sitting on the middle section for as long as they have. Not that the reading is impossible to defend, not that the language is too poetic to nail down, it is that the language is too plain, the tablet is too calm, the scribe is too matter-of-fact. Whoever wrote this tablet believed the information on it was already known, was already being taught, was already the background against which any halfway educated reader in the temple archives would place any observation of the sky. And the tablet, in that quiet, matter-of-fact voice, tells you what comets are actually for and where the route eventually ends. It has been telling you for about 4,000 years. It is still telling you. It is waiting in the vault, and in the parallel fragments, and in the pulled monographs, and in the private letters, for enough people to notice it that the middle section can finally be read out loud. Maybe that day is closer than it looks. Maybe the 8th reset, and everything else already gathering, is exactly the pressure that finally opens the vault. Or maybe the tablet sits there for another 100 years. Either way, the route is still running. The carriers are still coming. The sowing is still happening at the red field, and at the blue field, and at every other station the scribe took the trouble to name for us in that clean, quiet hand. And the throne of the deep gate, whatever it turns out to be, whoever it turns out to be, is still there, at the end of the route, keeping count.